November 2nd, 1944, 3:47 p.m., somewhere over Czechoslovakia. Lieutenant Bruce Carr watches the oil pressure gauge drop to a flat zero. Black smoke pours from the cowling of his P-51 Mustang. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine screams in the dialect of metal grinding against metal. 30 seconds ago, he was the apex predator. He was leading a high-speed strafing run against a German airfield. Now, he is a dead man flying. An 88mm shell fragment has performed a surgical strike on his engine compartment. The oil line is severed. Without oil, the Merlin engine will seize in approximately 90 seconds. After that, the four-bladed propeller becomes a 400-pound anchor. The P-51, the finest fighter of the age, becomes a glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Carr has exactly one option. He pulls back the canopy. He rolls the dying Mustang inverted. He drops into the freezing Czechoslovakian sky. At 8,000 feet, the silk canopy deploys. Below him, enemy territory stretches to every horizon. He is 200 miles behind the German lines. He has no radio. He has no weapon except a .45 caliber pistol with 7 rounds. The mathematics of survival are brutal. American pilots shot down over occupied territory have a 23% chance of returning to Allied lines. The other 77% spend the rest of the war in a prison camp or an unmarked grave. But Bruce Carr is about to become the exception to every statistic ever written. In 4 days, he won't just escape. He will hijack one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the German arsenal and fly it home. This is the strategic autopsy of a pilot who refused to accept the limitations of his situation. This is the story of the man who took off in a Mustang and returned in a Focke-Wulf. The mission was supposed to be a routine deletion of German assets. Bruce Carr was flying with the 353rd Fighter Squadron, 354th Fighter Group. These were the pioneer Mustang pilots. They were the first to take the P-51 into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. His aircraft was named Angel's Playmate. It was a 600-horsepower masterpiece of aluminum and high-octane fuel. The target was a German airfield near the Czechoslovakian border. Strafing is the most dangerous work in the sky. It is a low-altitude audit of the enemy's ground defenses. You fly at 400 miles per hour, 50 feet off the deck. You are a target for every rifle, machine gun, and flak battery on the base. Carr led the dive. His 6 50 caliber machine guns were shredding Junkers bombers on the ground. Then, the sky erupted. The 88mm flak is the heavy artillery of the air. It is designed to blow B-17 bombers out of the sky at 25,000 feet. At low altitude, it is apocalyptic. A shell detonated near Carr's nose. The concussion slammed the Mustang sideways. The fragment didn't blow the wing off. It performed a much more quiet, lethal task. It severed the main oil line. A Merlin engine without oil is a ticking clock. The internal temperatures skyrocket. The bearings melt. The pistons weld themselves to the cylinders. Carr felt the shudder in the stick. He smelled the scorched lubricant. He climbed for altitude. Every foot of height was a second of time. At 8,000 feet, the engine finally quit. The silence was absolute. Carr bailed. He hit the frozen ground hard. The landing wasn't gentle. His ankle twisted on impact. It wasn't broken, but it throbbed with a rhythmic agony. He gathered the silk canopy and buried it under autumn leaves. He had maybe 20 minutes before the German patrols arrived. He was alone. He was injured. He was cold. The logical move was to head south, to move toward the advancing Allied lines. But Carr understood a different kind of logic. He knew the Germans would expect him to run away. He knew they would search the woods to the south and west with clinical efficiency. He decided to do the one thing they wouldn't expect. He headed north. He moved toward the very airfield he had just tried to destroy. He was walking into the mouth of the wolf. The next 4 days would be a master class in evasion. He would sleep in ditches. He would drink from freezing streams. He would watch German patrols pass within yards of his position. But as he watched the airfield from the tree line, he saw something that changed his plan from survival to theft. He saw a fully fueled Focke-Wulf 190 sitting in a revetment. The hijack was on. Bruce Ward Carr was not born into a dynasty of aviators. He was born on January 28, 1924, in Union Springs, New York. It was a place of agriculture and cold winters. But by 1939, at 15 years old, Carr was already speaking the dialect of flight. The year matters. September 1939 was the moment the world caught fire. Germany had invaded Poland. The strategic map of Europe was being redrawn in blood. A farm kid in upstate New York couldn't see the global catastrophe. He only saw the cockpit. He learned to fly from a local crop duster named Earl. It wasn't a formal academy. It was a biplane, a dusty field, and a stick. Carr was a natural. He had a clinical instinct for the machine. By the time he was 16, he had logged more flight time than most military cadets. On September 3, 1942, Carr enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. He was 18. The aviation cadet training program was his gateway. In a stroke of institutional irony, his instructor turned out to be the same man who taught him to fly 3 years earlier. Earl had joined up too. He looked at Carr's application. He saw the 240 flight hours already logged. He recommended Carr for the accelerated program. By August 1943, Carr was a flight officer. By February 1944, he was in England. He was assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. This was the Pioneer Mustang Group. They were the first unit in the European theater to fly the P-51 in combat. Carr was given a P-51B. He named it Angel's Playmate. The P-51 was the finest propeller-driven fighter ever built. It was a 437-mile-per-hour solution to the problem of long-range bomber escort. But it was a demanding mistress. The Merlin engine required precise management. The torque on takeoff could flip a novice pilot. Carr didn't just fly the Mustang, he dominated it. His first engagement was a study in clinical aggression. On March 8, 1944, he spotted a Messerschmitt Bf-109 over Germany. He gave chase. The German pilot was experienced. He tried to escape by diving for the deck. He flew just above the treetops at 400 miles per hour. Standard tactics dictated caution. Chasing an enemy into the trees at those speeds is a suicide pact. Carr didn't blink. He followed the German into the forest. The chase covered 40 miles. Both aircraft were clearing the canopy by inches. Carr fired. He missed. He fired again. He didn't shoot the German down. He simply terrified him. The German pilot, realizing Carr wouldn't pull up, panicked. He pulled his aircraft into a sharp climb and ejected. He was too low. The parachute didn't deploy. The Bf-109 crashed into a hillside. When Carr returned to base, he expected a medal. He got a reprimand. His commanding officer called the flight over-aggressive. He called it reckless. The kill wasn't even credited initially. Technically, the German had killed himself. But this engagement defined Bruce Carr. Where others saw a dangerous forest, he saw a target. Where others saw a limit, he saw a suggestion. He was an ace in the making. He was a pilot who looked for the impossible odds. By October 1944, he had 7 confirmed kills. He was officially an ace. He had mastered the Mustang, but in 4 days, he would have to master its greatest rival. He would have to learn the dialect of the butcher bird in a single night. The P-51 was gone, the forest was cold, and the German airfield was waiting. In late 1944, the air over Europe was a clash of 2 engineering philosophies. On one side was Carr's P-51 Mustang. The Germans called it the long-nosed bastard. It was built around the Rolls-Royce Merlin V12. It was a liquid-cooled precision instrument. It was designed for endurance. It was a marathon runner that could sprint at 30,000 feet. On the other side was the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The Allies called it the butcher bird. The FW-190 was a clinical expression of power. Unlike the Mustang, it used a massive BMW 801 radial engine. It was air-cooled and rugged. It didn't look like a marathon runner. It looked like a fist. The FW-190 A8 variant, the one sitting in that Czechoslovakian revetment, was a 1,700 horsepower monster. It was wider, heavier, and more violent than the P-51. It featured a wide-track landing gear. This made it stable on the rough, muddy airfields of the Eastern Front. The P-51, by comparison, had narrow gear that was notorious for collapsing on bad runways. The firepower was equally disproportionate. Carr's Mustang carried 6 50 caliber machine guns. They were reliable. They were effective. The butcher bird carried 2 13mm machine guns in the cowling and 4 20mm cannons in the wings. It didn't just punch holes. It performed a surgical deletion of whatever it hit. 1 4-second burst from an FW-190 could saw a B-17 Flying Fortress in half. The cockpits were worlds apart. The P-51 featured a bubble canopy. It offered a 360-degree view. It was spacious. The labels were in English. The systems were electrical. The FW-190 cockpit was a cramped, armored cell. It sat high above the massive engine. The visibility was good, but the ergonomics were purely German. The controls weren't electrical. They were a sophisticated network of push rods and mechanical linkages. Every switch, every gauge, and every warning light was labeled in Gothic script. Fahrwerk for landing gear, Gashebel for throttle, Zündung for ignition. To Bruce Carr, it was a wall of incomprehensible text. But he had spent months studying gun camera footage of these aircraft. He knew their turn rates. He knew their stall speeds. He knew their weaknesses. He knew that if he could get the engine to start, the physics of flight remained the same. A wing generates lift regardless of the language written on it. The FW-190 was the enemy he had been hunting for 172 missions. He had shot them down. He had watched them burn. Now, his life depended on making one of them breathe. He was cold. He was hungry. He was standing in the shadows of the tree line. He watched the German ground crew walk away from the aircraft. The butcher bird was fueled. It was armed. It was alone. Carr looked at his twisted ankle. He looked at the open ground between the forest and the revetment. The arithmetic was simple. If he stayed in the woods, he was a prisoner. If he reached that cockpit, he was a pilot again. The northward gamble was about to pay the ultimate dividend. He was moving from the dirt to the sky. Bruce Carr was a dead man according to the manual. He had hit the Czechoslovakian dirt with a twisted ankle and a useless parachute. He was 200 miles behind the most fortified front line in military history. The standard operating procedure for a downed pilot was a westward retreat. You run toward the Allied lines. You hide by day and move by night. You hope the underground finds you before the SS does. Carr performed a clinical assessment of his reality. He knew the Germans understood the manual better than he did. They would search the woods to the south and west. They would set up checkpoints on every bridge and road leading toward France. If he followed the manual, he was walking into a trap. He decided to invert the logic. He headed north. He moved toward the enemy airfield he had just strafed. It was an act of tactical defiance. Carr knew the German patrols would assume he was running away. They would never expect a pilot to return to the scene of the crime. For the next 4 days, Carr lived in the dialect of the hunted. November in Central Europe is a brutal auditor. The temperature dropped below freezing at night. He had no coat. He had no food. He moved through the thickest parts of the forest. He stayed off the trails. He crossed freezing streams to throw off the scent of tracking dogs. The hunger was a constant, rhythmic ache. By day 3, his body began cannibalizing its own muscle tissue for energy. He found a stream and drank until his throat was numb. He watched a German infantry patrol pass within 150 yards of his position. He lay motionless in a ditch for 2 hours. He didn't blink. He didn't shiver. By day 4, the exhaustion reached its terminal point. Carr was burning 4,000 calories a day just to stay warm. He had consumed 0. He reached the edge of the airfield. Through the branches of the tree line, he saw the infrastructure of the Luftwaffe. He saw the hangars. He saw the fuel trucks. He saw the guards. His initial plan was surrender. The Luftwaffe treated captured pilots with a cold, professional respect. It meant a prison camp, but it also meant 3 meals a day and a roof. It was the safe choice. It was the rational choice. But as the sun began to set, Carr saw a mechanic perform a pre-flight check on an FW-190. He watched the fuel truck pull away. He watched the mechanic cycle the propeller. He heard the BMW radial engine roar to life, then settle into a smooth, mechanical idle. The mechanic shut it down. He climbed out. He covered the cockpit and walked back toward the main barracks. The airfield was settling into a skeleton night watch. Carr looked at the aircraft. He looked at the open space of the tarmac. The plan changed. He was no longer a fugitive looking for a prison. He was an ace looking for a cockpit. He would wait for the 3 a.m. dead zone, the moment when human alertness is at its lowest. The gamble was no longer about walking. It was about flying. He began the crawl toward the revetment. Every inch of movement was a calculated risk. The northward gamble was about to reach its climax. Bruce Carr waited for the 3 a.m. dead zone. This is the hour when the human brain is at its most vulnerable. Alertness drops. The cold becomes a physical weight. The skeleton night watch at the airfield had settled into a rhythmic, bored complacency. From the tree line, Carr performed a final clinical scan of the eastern perimeter. The FW-190 set in a revetment 80 yards from his position. It was partially draped in camouflage netting. It was a dark, lethal silhouette against the snow. The 2 mechanics had done their job with German precision. They had topped the fuel tanks. They had checked the magnetos. They had verified the oil pressure. To the Germans, it was an aircraft ready for a morning sortie. To Carr, it was a getaway car. The distance was 80 yards of open ground. No cover, no shadows. If a guard looked in his direction, the mission would end with a single shot. Carr didn't hesitate. He moved. He stayed low to the ground. His twisted ankle screamed with every heartbeat. He didn't crawl. He moved in a fast, rhythmic limp that kept his profile below the height of the landing gear. He covered the distance in 40 seconds. He reached the shadow of the wing. The metal was freezing. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and hot oil was intoxicating. He climbed onto the wing. The canopy was unlocked. This was the first stroke of luck in 4 days. He slid the heavy armored glass back and dropped into the cockpit. The first thing he felt was the cramped architecture. The FW-190 was built for utility, not comfort. His knees pressed against the lower instrument panel. The second thing he felt was the silence. The airfield was still asleep. Carr sat in the dark. He closed his eyes. He performed a sensory audit of the controls. The stick was between his knees. The throttle was on the left. The rudder pedals were at his feet. The universal dialect of flight was present. But the labels were a nightmare. Every gauge was a circle of Gothic script. He didn't have a manual. He didn't have a light. He had to identify the systems by their position and their plumbing. He traced the fuel lines to the selector valve. He identified the magneto switch by its 4-position tactile click. He found the inertia starter. In a P-51, you flip a switch and the engine turns over. In the FW-190, the process is a mechanical ritual. To engage the flywheel, you listen to it whine until it reaches a specific pitch. Then you engage the clutch to turn the massive 14-cylinder BMW engine. Carr knew that once he pulled that handle, the silence was over. 1,700 horsepower would wake up everyone within 5 miles. There would be no secret exit. There would only be a violent, high-speed sprint for the horizon. He checked the fuel gauge one last time. It was on the far right. The needle was pinned to the top. Full tanks, 500 miles of range. Carr gripped the starter handle. He was no longer a fugitive. He was the pilot of a stolen butcher bird. The transition from the dirt to the sky was seconds away. Bruce Carr sat in a mechanical puzzle. He had 4 hours until sunrise. He used every minute to perform a tactile translation of the machine. The pilot didn't speak German, but he spoke the language of the 1,700 horsepower BMW 801 radial engine. Every engine has a pulse. Every system has a logic. Carr identified the gauges by their clusters. Airspeed was top left. The altimeter was top center. The engine instruments were grouped on the right. The T-shaped handle for the starter sat on the right console. In the P-51, the system was electrical. In the Focke-Wulf, it was a mechanical inertia starter. The mechanism required the pilot to pull the handle to wind up a heavy flywheel. He had to listen as the pitch rose from a low growl to a high-frequency scream. Once the flywheel possessed enough kinetic energy, the pilot would push the handle to engage the engine. Carr gripped the T-handle. He pulled. The mechanical whine filled the cramped cockpit. It sounded like a siren. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The pitch reached its peak. Carr pushed. The 14-cylinder engine coughed. A cloud of blue smoke erupted from the cowling. Then the butcher bird roared to life. The noise was an apocalyptic hammer. At idle, the FW-190 sounds like a rhythmic thunderstorm. The airfield was no longer silent. Ground crews emerged from the barracks. They were shouting. They were confused. They expected to see a German pilot testing a late-night repair. Carr didn't give them time to check the manifest. He shoved the throttle forward. The FW-190 lurched. The butcher bird is nose-heavy. It is eager to fly. The tail came up almost immediately. Carr aimed the aircraft between 2 main hangars. He was taxiing at 60 miles per hour. The hangars rushed toward him at 90 miles per hour. Ground troops dived for cover. Carr pulled back on the stick. The FW-190 leaped into the pre-dawn sky. He cleared the roof of the hangar by inches. He was airborne. He was in a stolen German fighter. He was 200 miles behind enemy lines. The landing gear was his first technical crisis. He found a lever on the left. He pulled it. A satisfying mechanical thunk vibrated through the floor. The gear was up. The drag was gone. The aircraft accelerated. Carr identified the gyro compass. He oriented himself west-southwest. He pointed the nose toward France. He dropped to treetop level. He flew 50 feet off the deck at 300 miles per hour. At this altitude, the pilot was invisible to radar. He was too low for heavy flak. He was a silver and black blur screaming through the Czechoslovakian forest. The flight to freedom had begun, but the gauntlet of tracers was just ahead. The most dangerous part of the hijack wasn't the Germans. It was his own side. Carr was flying a plane with a swastika on the tail into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. He was about to find out exactly how good Allied anti-aircraft fire really was. The flight to freedom was a 200-mile sprint through a clinical hellscape. Bruce Carr was flying the FW-190 West. The sun was rising behind his tail. The terrain changed from the dense Czechoslovakian forests to the open farmsteads of eastern France. He stayed at treetop level. He was hedge-hopping. The propeller wash-kicked up dust from the dirt roads. French civilians dived into ditches as the black-crossed fighters screamed overhead at 300 miles per hour. But as he crossed the front lines, the arithmetic of his survival shifted. Allied anti-aircraft gunners did not see a pilot escaping. They saw what they were trained to kill, a German butcher bird flying at low altitude toward their positions. They opened fire. The sky ahead of Carr became a web of 50 caliber tracers. Every Allied gun in the sector was tracking his canopy. He was taking fire from his own side. He had no radio to announce himself. The Focke-Wulf's radio was tuned to German frequencies. Even if he had found the right dial, the ground crews wouldn't believe a voice in English coming from a Luftwaffe fighter. Carr performed the only maneuver available. He flew lower. He dropped the aircraft to 20 feet. He was so low that the muzzle flashes from the ground batteries were at eye level. He later estimated that every 50 caliber machine gun in France took a shot at him during that 30-mile sprint. The FW-190 shuddered as rounds clipped the wings. The armored glass of the cockpit held, but the sound of metal hitting metal was a constant, rhythmic reminder of his mortality. The German engineering was robust. The BMW 801 radar engine took hits and kept breathing. Ahead, Carr recognized the geometry of the landscape. He saw the familiar landmarks of A-66. This was the airfield at Orconte, France. This was home. This was the base of the 354th Fighter Group. But as he approached, he realized the base was already at battle stations. They saw a lone German fighter circling their field. The anti-aircraft batteries around the perimeter were already rotating their barrels. They were preparing to blow him out of the sky before he could drop a single bomb. Carr lined up with the grass beside the main runway. He had no time for a landing pattern. He had no time for a radio check. He reached for the landing gear lever. He pulled. Nothing happened. He pumped the handle. The gear remained locked in the wells. He didn't know the Focke-Wulf's landing gear operated on a specific hydraulic selector valve. He was pulling the wrong handle. He was out of time. Carr made a split-second decision. He was going to belly land. He lowered the flaps. He cut the throttle. The FW-190 sank toward the grass. The aircraft hit the ground at 90 miles per hour. It threw up a massive rooster tail of mud and debris. It slid for 300 yards, the metal screaming as it ground against the earth. The Focke-Wulf came to a stop in a cloud of dust. Carr was alive, but as the canopy slid back, he didn't see a welcoming committee. He saw a dozen American military police with rifles raised. They were screaming for the pilot to get out with his hands up. They were expecting a prisoner. They were about to meet a legend. The mud was still settling around the wreckage of the FW-190 when the first military police arrived. They didn't see a hero. They saw a German fighter that had successfully penetrated the heart of their airfield. The MPs surrounded the aircraft. Rifles were leveled at the cockpit. They were expecting a Luftwaffe pilot. They were expecting a prisoner of war. The canopy slid back. A mud-splattered figure in a torn American flight suit climbed onto the wing. He looked at the barrels pointed at his chest and shouted, "I'm Captain Carr of this goddamn squadron." Nobody believed him. Bruce Carr had been missing for 4 days. He was listed as missing in action. In the clinical world of 1944 combat records, he was as good as dead. The MPs kept their weapons trained on him until a staff car arrived. Colonel George Bickle, the commanding officer of the 354th Fighter Group, stepped out of the vehicle. He looked at the destroyed German fighter. He looked at the exhausted pilot. Bickle asks a single question. Carr, where in the hell have you been, and what have you been doing now? The story spread through the Army Air Forces like a wildfire. Bruce Carr became the only American in the European theater to take off in a Mustang and return with a Focke-Wulf. He had stolen a state-of-the-art enemy machine, deciphered its controls in the dark, and survived the most dangerous flight of the war. But for Carr, the war wasn't over. He was just getting started. 5 months after his escape, on April 2, 1945, Carr performed a second act of impossible arithmetic. He was leading a flight of 4 P-51s near Schweinfurt. He spotted a massive formation of German fighters above him. The pilot performed a quick count. There were 60 aircraft, a mix of Bf-109s and FW-190s. The odds were 15-1. Standard tactics dictated immediate evasion. The manuals said to disengage and report. Carr ignored the manuals. He keyed his radio and gave a 2-word order: engaging. The 4 Mustangs climbed into the teeth of the formation. Carr used the confusion of the surprise attack to move through the German ranks like a wolf. In the space of 3 minutes, Bruce Carr shot down 5 German aircraft. He became an ace in a day. His flight accounted for 15 kills in total. The Americans suffered 0 losses. By the time the war ended, Carr was 21 years old. He had 15 confirmed aerial victories and had flown 172 combat missions. He stayed in uniform. He flew 57 combat missions in F-86 Sabres during the Korean War. A decade later, he flew 286 combat missions in F-100 Super Sabres over Vietnam. Across 3 wars and 3 generations of aircraft technology, he logged 505 combat missions. He retired in 1973 as a colonel. His chest was covered in the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. In 1997, a year before his death, Bruce Carr flew one more time. He was 73 years old. He arrived at the air show in a P-51D Mustang. He came in over the crowd at 300 knots, 50 feet off the deck. It was the same approach he had used 50 years earlier when he brought a stolen Focke-Wulf home to France. When he landed, someone asked him what he was thinking during those high-G maneuvers. He shrugged and said, "Same thing I was always thinking. What's the airplane capable of? What am I capable of? Let's find out." That is the audit of Bruce Carr. He didn't just survive. He refused to accept that his options were limited by the circumstances. He looked at a German cockpit and saw a way home. He looked at 60 enemy fighters and saw a target. If this strategic autopsy of an American legend was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Subscribe for more stories of the engineering of power and the pilots who broke the rules. Leave a comment. Would you have the courage to climb into an enemy cockpit and pull the starter? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.